First of all, I want to thank you all for coming here today. My name is Greg Daniil, and I was invited by Stephanie and Make-A-Wish Missouri to present a little bit on grief. And that's obviously a sobering topic. A little bit about me, just so you know where I'm coming from. I hold a master's degree, both in theology and counseling from Covenant Seminary here in St. Louis. I'm also certified through Alan Wolfelt, if you've ever heard that name, out of Fort Collins, Colorado, with a certificate in death and grief studies. And why would somebody do all that? As sobering as all that is. The reason is because my most important credential is because grief entered my life when my son died, 17 years old in a single car accident. So grief changed the trajectory of my life, and that's what put me on a path to go to school and to get some education, because it was one thing to experience it, it was another thing to then find out more about it. And grief is a huge, big topic. Today I'm going to attempt to keep it fairly synoptic into what would be appropriate for Make-A-Wish, for both the staff and the volunteers. It is much bigger than that. So pardon me as I'm going to refer to some notes. Those kind of help keep me on track because I don't want to go too far afield in this big topic. So welcome to Grief 101, I'm going to call this. Why 101? Because hardly any of us ever get any training on grief until it shows up. I know that was my particular story. But there's so much to it that we need to be aware of, especially considering when as I became more familiar with Make-A-Wish, that there are just those times when a wish child dies, doesn't make it. And then it's everybody left behind, the family, everybody left behind that's affected and has to enter their own grief journey. So those circumstances, sometimes you all are involved in, potentially, in some way, shape, or form. And that it all starts why? It starts because you're involved with putting together a wish, trying to make a wish come true. And it's that very beginning that really sets the stage for potential grief when a child passes away. Why? Because even in those early stages, in those early contacts, you've already started a relationship. Now, we think in terms of, well, maybe grief is just about if you've had an intense relationship, somebody you've known all your life, a family member. No, grief shows up because a relationship existed. And just the very contact with another person, another family, another human being, another child is the beginning of a relationship. So that sets the stage then for the fact that if a child passes away, there's the potential for you to need to do some grief processing. And so that's what today will be about. It'll be about how do we do good grief processing. I say good grief because there's good ways to do it and bad ways to do it. You know, some people will say, well, time heals all wounds. No, it's what you do in that time that's going to make the difference. So I'm going to be talking today about good grief processing and what that looks like and the kind of things you can avail yourself of as need be. And I'm going to give you some additional resources as well. So a relationship, the knowing of another human being, sets the stage. And it's when we're confronted with that death or that loss, that passing away, that grief can begin. Why? Because it's become personal now. It's not an unknown person. This is somebody, or an unknown family. This is somebody or a family that you've been in contact with in one way, shape, or form. The other foundations for experiencing grief, just so I can put that out there, since this is kind of a didactic time, I don't want you to have as much of the full picture as I could. It's not only about relationship. What else sets a stage for grief? Loving, caring. You see, we can only grieve and experience grief because we love or we care, or we're in a relationship. Those are the three foundations upon which we can say grief is going to show up in one way, shape, or form, in some level, in some kind of intensity. I can only imagine, most of you are not involved with Make-A-Wish because you don't care. The whole reason you're here, the whole reason you got involved in this, the whole reason something tugged on you to do all this is because you, number one, are a loving person, a caring person, and a relational person. So that sets the stage right there. The very fact you're involved in this organization sets a stage for you may have to deal with some grief. In a way, the very fact that grief shows up is a confirmation of those things. That there's been love, there's been caring, there's been relationship. It's a whole different way of looking at it. Grief is actually an honorable thing because it's a statement about those three capacities that we have as human beings. And I'm sure drives most of you in your involvement with Make-A-Wish. So when grief kicks in, when does it kick in? As soon as we're made aware of a loss. When grief kicks in, what happens? I'm going to say this. I'm going to say dimensions begin to show up. Back in the 60s, when good grief studies were being done with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that name. Back in the 60s, she did the seminal work on grief and how is grief processed by people. How do we humanely react and deal with loss? And she came up with what she called stages. If you've had any kind of familiarity with this, you've probably heard the term stages. Her stages were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And that's about as much as most of us have ever gotten. And that's from the 60s. And trust me, a whole lot has changed since the 60s. I am proof that a whole lot has changed since the 60s. That's not what we talk about nowadays. We don't talk about stages. We talk about dimensions. Why? Well, the first point would be simply this. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, before she passed away, she regretted ever using the word stages because everybody grabbed onto that word and said, oh, okay, well, grief is going to be nice and neat and tidy and linear, and I can know that I can do this stage, denial, and then when I'm done with that, I can do anger, and I can do, and then it's a known entity, and I know exactly how to get from point A to point B. I know how it begins, and I know how to make it end, and I just got to make sure I do all the right work. She regretted it because that's what we did with that word, and the truth is that's not how grief shows up. Grief shows up in many dimensions. It's more than just those 5: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It's more than that. All kinds of emotional processes begin in us because it's more of an explosion, and that explosion puts us in a place where we have all kinds of dimensions, all kinds of facets, all kinds of emotions, all kinds of thoughts showing up simultaneously, and we're jumping back and forth, and we're not sure why am I feeling this way this minute? Why am I mad about it? But then I'm okay about it. But then I'm sad about it. But then I don't know what to do about it. And this gets confusing after a while. And why am I going back and forth? And I don't even know exactly what to think or what to feel. And it's at that point that you really know grief just showed up. Because grief is going to be very confusing. Grief is messy. It's not nice and neat and linear. It's a very messy process. People come into my office, and as I began to explain this kind of thing to them, because where have any of us had really like any kind of like didactic teaching about grief? I don't remember. I called this Grief 101, right? I don't remember Grief 101 in high school. I don't remember it in my college experience. Hopefully it's some places now. But we don't know about it, so this hits us, and it puts us in a different place than almost anything else we're going to experience in life. And people come in, and that's where they are. And I begin talking in these terms. I can't tell you the number of people who break down and cry. And here's what I hear. I thought I was going crazy. I thought there was something wrong with me. Why would I be doing all this? I don't get it. And so when I explain this part of grief, this is what grief is. So if it seems messy, if it seems at times there's some confusion, if it seems at times you're just not sure what to do, where to go, how to be, that's what grief calls for. And if that's an experience that you wind up with, you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to be nice and neat and linear and tidy about this. Why? Because this is a thing of the heart. Grief is a heart issue, a heart condition. Grief is not an intellectual exercise. It's something we're doing with our heart. Why? Because we love, because we care, because we're relational. It hits us right here in our heart. So, the other thing that's important to understand about grief in the context of how you might experience it is there's going to be two components to grief. There's going to be a common kind of part to it and a unique part to it. The common part, that's the things I can talk about the dimensions. It's common for grief to have a dimension of sadness. Why? Well, because there's been a loss. A loss is going to make us sad. There's a human being that used to be here who's not here now. It would be a common experience then for sadness to show up in people's hearts. So I can talk about all the common experiences and all the common dimensions, but today I chose to actually take a look at the other part, and that's the unique part. Every grief has its own unique component to it. And why is that? Well, first of all, let's get back to what we started talking about. There's been some kind of relationship. Whatever form that took, it might have been a phone call, it might have been a home visit. Whatever that took, there's already been some kind of relationship. There's a knowing of another human being. And each person involved is going to have different kinds of relationships created. So because the relationships are different, the grieving of that is going to be different. Because the people involved in that relationship are all different, the grieving is going to be different. There may be all these common things, sadness, maybe anger, confusion. There may be all these common things, but there's going to be these unique things. Most importantly, probably the most correct thing I could say is because each one of you is different. And because you're different, how you uniquely have to process the grief that's showing up now on your doorstep is going to be unique. It's going to be about how you have been created, what your family of origin was about, how you do loving, how you do caring, how you do relationships. We all do them differently. So the griefs are going to be unique. And because there's a unique measure to it, there's also a sense of aloneness in it. Why? Because only you can do that grief. Only you've made that contact. Only you've had that experience. So that grief is going to be unique to you. And that, because it becomes unique, that in and of itself, just because of that simple statement, means there's going to be a sense of aloneness to it, because only you can do the grief that's being called upon for you to do. That's why I will give you this. It's never a good idea to compare your grief. Am I grieving the same way this person's grieving? As soon as we start comparing, here's what happens. Either they're doing it wrong, or I think I'm doing it wrong. And most of us are self-evaluative enough that we start thinking, well, what's wrong with me? I'm doing it wrong. I'm not doing it the way they're doing it. Well, the way they're doing it is out of their uniqueness, and you have your own. So I'm going to caution you, don't compare. Don't try to take a look at how somebody else is doing it and say, well, that must be how I'm supposed to do it. No, there's never a winner in that. So I know it's a hard thing to do because we have a tendency in our humanity to compare, to try to figure out, is something, am I on the right track? I'm on the wrong track. I'm just going to say that's one of the battles that shows up in doing good grief work, is how do I lay that down? How do I not compare? How do I just pay attention to what's happening inside of me? How do I just pay attention to the things I need to do in order to work through and to process through the grief that has showed up? And if the grief, again, has showed up, why? Because I'm relational in some way, I'm caring in some way, and I'm loving in some way. Another way that makes grief very unique to each person as well, and this is a real key point, is grief will always open up grief. If you've had other griefs in your life, the experience of a grief showing up now will touch on that. Again, that's another unique thing, right? Only you've had the certain losses that you bring to the table. It will touch on that. It might open that up some too. That's a normal, natural thing to happen. When we're confronted by grief, of course we're going to go back and we're going to touch on our other griefs, which means that's yours, that's nobody else's. It's another unique piece of the grief process. So with unique kind of put in its place now, let's come back to a common theme in all of our lives. It is simply this: we prefer to avoid pain. How many people here can't wait till the next painful experience in their life? Thank you, nobody's put up a hand. I appreciate that. We avoid pain. That's what we want to do. And let's the honest statement is, grief is pain. It's a pain of the heart. It's a wounding of the heart. We feel it and it hurts. Yet there's something inside of us that says, hey, I'm supposed to avoid pain. So it's not uncommon then for us to decide, well, okay, I need to just stop caring. I'm just going to stop caring. Have you ever heard that show up in other parts, maybe? Maybe not so much with grief, but in other areas of your life, relationships. Well, I'll break up that hurt. I'll just stop caring. Is that possible? First of all, I would say for most people it's not. If you at your core are a loving, caring, relational person, you're probably not going to be able to turn that off real well. So that is already automatically a formula for failure and for internal frustration. There are some people who can. I will tell you that. I've seen people who can turn it off. And is that advisable? No, not even for those people who can. I would say it's never an advisable thing to try to turn off that piece of you. Why? Well, there's another concept I'm going to introduce here. It's called bleed over. Bleed over says this. When it comes to our emotional world, it says we think we're really good at saying, I'm just going to stop caring about this little part of my world, my emotional world. I can compartmentalize that. And the reality is this: you can't. It will bleed over into other areas of your life. So that attempt to turn off loving, caring, attempt to turn off being relational, ultimately is going to show up in other areas of your life. Do you really want to wind up being a person who is no longer loving, no longer caring, no longer relational? I don't think you do. So what do we do with that? Because now, what have I done? I've set a stage that says, okay, you're a certain kind of person. You don't want to try to destroy that, because that's what brings value into your life. Yet that's the very reason you're going to have hurt and pain. What do we do with that? Well, first thing we have to do is recognize that when it comes to grief and the pain that's in grief, because it's a hard issue, you don't go over it, you don't go under it, you don't go around it. You have to go through it. That's why it's a process. When we talk about grief as a process, that means it's because it's something you're going to go through. There'll be some common parts to it and some unique parts to it. So how do we begin to do then something different when it comes to grief that allows us to go through it? I'm going to add another a component now. and that's called mourning. Our society is so interesting. We have taken the words grief and mourning and kind of used them synonymously, as if they're the same thing. We'll say, well, I'm grieving or I'm mourning. The reality is this: those are two very, very different things. Grief is what we're doing internally. Grief is the emotional mess that's happening inside of there. Grief refers to our internal process, whereas mourning says, how do I take what's happening inside? How do I take the internal thing and give it some kind of external expression? Two very different things. The best approach to processing grief is to make sure you can add mourning to it. The ability to express outside of just your internal processing. What's the best example that I could use? Tears. You know, the tears are an outward expression. For many people, that has its own difficulty. That would be a whole nother session about tears. So one of the other ways that we get something outside is what? We talk about it. We give it verbal expression. So one of the best things we can do when we're grieving is talk about it. There's been studies done on all of this, and statistically, when somebody is grieving, and they know they're here and they're wanting to get here, they know that there's this road they have to go through of process, the best agent to help them do that is the ability to mourn, to give it some kind of outward expression. So if we just, for the moment anyway, let's just say we stuck with that whole idea of being able to talk about it. Well, how do you do that? My first suggestion would be a friend, a good friend, or a family member, somebody you trust, that you can just tell them what's going on inside of you. Hey, I made this connection, and the child didn't make it, and I'm hurting. You want to make sure, though, that the person you're talking to is, I'm going to call them grief aware, understands that this is a process for you, that they don't need to just hurry up and fix you, that this is something that just needs to be worked through and it's going to take a little time, but you need to be able to express these things. So if you hear responses like this, well, you need to just get over it. Just me even saying that, what did that do to your heart? You just need to get over it. Can't we just put this behind us and move on? Let's get back to normal. Those kinds of expressions implicitly are saying, stop caring, stop loving, let's just be done with it and move on. And that's not what your heart needs. What your heart needs is somebody who will just say, yeah, I'm sure that's hard. I get it. What else is going on? How's this happening inside of you? So somebody who is aware that you just need to process is the right person for you to spend some time with and be able to mourn, give an outward expression to what's happening inside, which will help you move through the process of grieving. The honest evaluation of all of this, though, is a lot of people don't have that kind of person. That's why I got into this work. It's because I didn't have that kind of person. We want to think our family's there, but sometimes they can't be there either. So rather than be part of the problem, I chose to be part of the solution, which is why I do grief work. It's not unusual for somebody to come into my office. And because people are different, sometimes they come in, for just a few sessions. Sometimes they come in for quite a few. Just what that person needs. And my office becomes the safe place where they can mourn. And I watch what happens with people, and it's amazing. You almost have to trust the process. It's amazing how they move through. And then they come to a place of healing of the heart. And what is that? What is healing of the heart? I'm going to give you a good grief definition. for what is healing of the heart. What's the ultimate goal of you saying, why would I even do this? Because in the healing of the heart that comes out of good grief work, you'll find a place where you're more human, where you're even more loving, where you're even more caring, where you're even more relational. You become more humane and more understanding, more empathetic. It grows you at a terrible cost, but it grows you as a human to be even more of a human, to be able then to have even more of a compassion, to want to give a child a wish.